Hello everybody and welcome to today's video where we will be breaking down the technique, training and philosophy of, in my opinion, the greatest crew of all time, the Kiwi pair who went to win 69 races in a row, undefeated, and set what many people think is an untouchable world record. And as always, I'll be aiming to do so in a way that you can understand it and bring elements of all of it into your rowing. And for those that are new here, my name's Jack Burns. I'm the founder of Edge Rowing, where we work with busy professionals over the age of 40, getting them rowing to the best versions of themselves. If you like free rowing content on how to get faster in simple and actionable ways, then consider subscribing to this channel and following for more. Anyways, to the juice. So first off, before we even get started, I'll link this in the bio. A lot of this stuff I just took from the Kiwi pair book. Really great insight into this crew and their story and what they did specifically. Both of them write in the book and tell their side of the story, so there's so much value in it. I'll link it below. I'd highly recommend it. One of my favorite rowing books. But first off, what was their philosophy? So from the book, one thing that you gather is the difference in their personalities. Hamish was largely introverted and Eric was largely extroverted. Again, in the book, it's really good because each of them go into what they think about their training and what makes them fast, and then they also go into like what they think about the other person, and some kind of interesting stories. Hamish would talk about how Eric was a bit of an ass to him in the early stages, but it's a really good example of how two very different personalities, when they get into a crew and have a similar objective, can go really, really quick. A big take home that I think you should have is they did what worked for them. We'll get into this, but they weren't afraid to experiment, try different techniques, try different training methods. They did obviously their training together in the pair. Also on land, they would look at their training information, their data, and do training on their own that worked for them. And it's a big reason for me why I think they went so quickly, and why a lot of rowers that come out of New Zealand, a tiny population of like 4 or 5 million, and become such successful crews. Part of this was they worked with this guy, Dan Plews, along with other coaches. He was a really good physiologist. He now coaches some of the best triathletes in the world. What I loved and what the rowing community I think really appreciated was how much they would share their training data. They would put so much of it out there, all of the erg scores, at a time when so many other programs, not naming any names, were incredibly secretive. So an insight into their training. Probably most infamously, they did no weights training. So despite all the studies that show that weights can be beneficial, they didn't do any. Basically, they tried it, didn't like it, and just went back to what worked for them. While I don't agree with this, and I think you should maybe stick with some of these things a little bit longer, it's an interesting example here of how you can find what the true needle movers are for you and focus on those. It's also maybe an example of how you shouldn't just copy everything that really quick crews do and do it for yourself. So they were in the 4 from 2005, I believe, until Beijing. They didn't have the performance they wanted in Beijing, and then they went into the pair. Basically, they worked with this guy, Dick Tonks, and they did a lot of training. There's some funny stories in the book about how they would train. This was the Lake Karapiro and Rowing New Zealand up here, and they would just basically show up every morning, and this guy would he would give such little advice, he'd give such little input. And there wasn't a training program or anything, but they would just show up and he would tell them where to row, and each point was either like 5k, 10k, or there was like the house or something like that. If someone knows Karapiro, let me know. There was this one point that was like 15k away. I think it was like the house. And Eric Murray said there was a point when every time they would turn up in the morning, Dick wouldn't even say hi. He would just say house. And they would, and that's all the input they would get from him. They would just go in the pair, row to the house, come back. And they were also in that group that they were in. They were also doing racing. They were racing at a low rate. So they would literally just go out as hard as they could. I'm guessing like a kind of threshold mid-intensity pace, and then come back. And then do basically the same again in the afternoon if they weren't doing their own training. At the upper end, they did 300k per week for 2 months. That is a lot of training. From 2013 to 2016, they basically fell out with the coach. They really didn't like him, but they found a new coach, Noel Donaldson, and they really started to experiment with their training and with their rig. And one thing that they did decide was that they were not going to do 300k a week. When it came to their rigging, basically all they did was play around with it and go with what felt comfortable for them. So they had an they had an unusually low rig on the gate heights. They were constantly tinkering with the outboard and the inboard. This is what I think they could have done better. Now, just because they tried weights, didn't like it, and then still went fast, doesn't mean that they wouldn't have benefited from doing weights training. Literally all endurance sports, cycling, swimming, triathlon, they all have some elements of weights training, and those rely far less on actual strength training. Some people, look, I know one guy in particular who was really, really good at rowing, and he would eat like shit before races, and he would try to eat healthier, and he would feel worse, and he would claim that he wasn't performing as well. So just because something works doesn't mean that you should keep doing it. For example, some people smoke 20 cigarettes a day and they live to 95. So technically their catch and their finish, in my opinion, wasn't great. More so, and I hate to kind of pick on one person in a crew, but Hamish in the stroke seat, he probably brought more physiology, but lacked in kind of how he put his blade into the water. And he kind of had an unorthodox method for taking his blade out. Hamish in stroke, Eric in bow, they row relatively different at the low rates. But you can even kind of see here from Hamish, from his side, the blade being relatively high as he approached the catch. And there would almost be, it's still obviously a very, very good catch, but there would be a kind of element of the blade kind of coming in this direction with the flow of the water. Whereas when we look at Eric in the bow seat, I just think it's a better example of getting connected at full slide here. Nice and reached out long, he hooks in there, and if you look at the amount of length that Eric loses before he starts pushing versus Hamish, you can see Eric just stays a little bit more still, while Hamish kind of opens a little bit with the back. And again, for those that haven't seen any other videos on this, you want to be fully connected before you push with the legs, because if you're pushing before your spoon is locked in the water, then you send force in that direction rather than leveraging the boat in that direction. So an interesting angle here, I think you can see. But again, in pairs and doubles, a lot of the time it's the bow seat's job to get the crew connected nicely so that the person in stroke seat can just focus on driving. And again, this crew went 6:08 in a pair. It's almost more interesting for me to look at what the fastest crews in the world don't do theoretically well. The second point, this is less of a criticism and more just their style. They talked about how they would approach the finish, and they basically would just have a really good, we'll get into the specifics in a few more slides, but they have a really good leg drive and then come through the finish quite soft. Eric was a bit more upright, and he kind of finished more with his arms, and Hamish would use more of his back, but then kind of pop the blade out a bit earlier, and he wouldn't draw all the way in. So the finishes were somewhat unconventional, maybe more so from Hamish, but again, it was more the catch, I think, is technically the one area that they could have definitely done better. So what did they do well? They did a lot of things well. The biggest one is the amount of force they produced when they were driving. Because they were so fit, because they were so strong, they could produce a lot of force, and I think this is the biggest reason as to why they went so quick. It was also about technically how they applied that force. So in terms of erg scores, Hamish, he was around 543, and he really was to the lighter end. So I really don't like to talk about power to weight because I know amateurs start asking about it. Don't ever focus on power to weight, but at the elite end, it can make a difference. Hamish, he was 88 kilos and he did a 543. Eric, I think he was more kind of like normal heavyweight man, around 91 kilos, and he could just consistently do a 541. So looking at the racing here in Amsterdam, this is the race. This wasn't the exact race, this was the event when they did this 608. What they are really good at doing is this idea of leveraging the boat past the point that the oar is in. So rather than just pushing it away and thinking about driving a fan and trying to shove the footplate away, they really like visualize this point that they're in here and lever themselves past it. And what that does when you think about it like that is it helps you with this idea of kind of a gradual build and hammer, and not just straight up trying to destroy the footplate instantly, but squeezing and building almost in the same way that you'd maybe think about lifting a fridge. But look, from here, once they are connected all the way to there, like that part of the stroke, when they go from like here to here, is where they win their races. This section of the stroke here, when they're swinging through right before they come to the work and generate loads and loads of acceleration, that's why they're so quick. they technically did it really, really well, but they also had a lot of force and were able to do that to a really, really high standard. So they would hang really, really well together, and then coming through the finish, you know, they wouldn't add much to it. They just to be a bit softer. But again, just a really, really good rhythm, strong, powerful drive. How can you bring this into your stroke? Try the idea of when you get connected to just squeeze and feel force and push at that first few inches of the drive. I think this is where most people get it wrong, and to be patient and gradual, and see if you can feel a connection and feel a push without driving your legs down as hard as possible. See if you can just do a little squeeze in the same way you would when you kind of stand up to get out of a chair. It's sort of same idea. And then from there, if you can get that easy grip at the start, you'll really get that idea. It'll just come, it'll snap, and you'll be able to set up this idea of leveraging the boat past the point where you put the oar in. One other point about force, they were actually so powerful that when they first went from an aluminium rigger to a carbon rigger, they had to go back to the aluminium because the carbon was too stiff. I think they later went into a carbon one, but they stuck with aluminium because it literally was just too stiff for them. So rhythm was something that they also did incredibly well. Like one of the easiest ways you can get rhythm is by spending hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of K together. But a lot of the time, rhythm is generated through force, and it's how you apply connection, and it's how you leverage the boat, which is going a little bit back to what we were talking about before. The last of the three technical things I think they did really, really well, and most elite crews do this to a really high level, is they were very, very fluid. Now, Eric kindly offered up his time to come on my podcast. If I can remember, I'll link it in the description. But one thing they talked about, which I wouldn't necessarily agree with, is they wouldn't have a strict, you know, arms, bodies away, and then slide. They would kind of have like a rock and pop, where they had quite a soft kind of knee pop, and they wouldn't get rocked over and set and then slide into the catch. We were talking about that, and it was something I actually disagreed with, because you need to be super loose, you need to be really calm, and you need to be really skilled to not damage the run at the boat at the catch. Because what's happening when you do this, when you're gradually kind of rocking over as you bring the knees up, you're sending more force onto the foot plate. So like what, in my opinion, I think works well, and it's far more coachable and tangible, rather than just saying be fluid, is to get rocked over as best you can, and then to hold that position going into the front, which helps you minimize damage on the stern at the front of the stroke. It helps you stay still when you later drive back with the legs. But you know, you can see here Eric and Hamish, both of them, they're kind of halfway up the slide here. And Eric's a bit more upright, and you can see he kind of gradually brings that angle down until he's a bit more rocked over there. Yeah, a lot of the time they would talk about minimizing run damage, keeping the boat moving, avoiding doing things that disrupted the run of the boat. So they had a very kind of like one speed recovery is what they talked about, where they wouldn't, you know, change the speed that they moved off the back or they moved into the front. They would just keep flowing in a continuous motion where they're not constantly trying to think about being more gradual as they put the blade in. But anyways, if you like this video, let me know. If you want more, subscribe to the channel, like the video. If you disagree with me, let me know in the comments as well. This was fun to watch, and I just want to shout out the Kiwi pair for sharing so much of their journey, writing that book, and just being such an asset to the sport. If you made it this far in the video, comment SSD storage device. I just bought a new one because my old hard drive is too slow.